This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order every card in this set review by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or by following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Brothers War Limited set review. So far we've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, white, and blue cards, and today we're continuing with black. In these videos, I'll discuss how good I think the new cards are going to be in the new limited format. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you'll find an explanation. Before we take a look at the first black card, a few reminders. This review is about limited. That means draft and sealed. This means that I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the new format. That means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. After all, every format is different. As I play the format, I'll be providing updates about it on the channel. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the review. Next up, it's Ashnod Flesh Mechanist, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 legendary creature human artificer at rare. She has Death Touch, and when she attacks, you can sacrifice another creature. If you do, create a tapped Power Stone token, and you can pay 5 generic mana and exile a creature card from your graveyard to create a tapped 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token. A 1 mana 1/1 with Death Touch is basically always a C. Costing very little mana and trading with anything is nice, and this one has tons of upside. Generating Power Stones in exchange for creatures is nice, although successfully attacking with Ashnod and also having creatures worth sacrificing is kind of asking a lot, since your opponent can still trade with this pretty easily. And her most powerful ability is definitely the fact that you can sink mana into her to turn creatures in your graveyard into zombie tokens. And you want to keep that ability around, so it's going to be pretty awkward to attack with Ashnod on a lot of boards. In situations where you can attack with her, she'll feel really absurd because she'll generate a Power Stone, sacrifice an expendable creature. That Power Stone can help you pay her ability, and you have a creature in your graveyard to exile. But all of that stuff isn't going to line up that consistently. I think she's basically like a great 1-drop that also has an amazing mana sink ability, and she'll very rarely actually create Power Stones. Still, I think she's a very good card. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Ashnod's Intervention, which for 1 black is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0 and gains. When this creature dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, return it to its owner's hand. So, returning the creature to your hand instead of the battlefield is a big downgrade from other versions of this effect we've seen before, but it does mean that you can use this to trade 1-for-1 with something while holding on to your creature. The idea here is you can use this alongside a creature with Unearth, which would normally be exiled, but then you get the creature back in your hand and you can cast it again. And that upside is going to feel pretty good, but alongside basically any other creature, this is not a very good trick. Sure, your creature will probably kill the opposing creature and you don't entirely lose it, but you lose a lot of tempo if you're using this on anything that isn't an Unearth creature, and I think that's a pretty big downside. Even with Unearth definitely featured in this format, I don't really think I see myself playing this. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Battlefield Butcher, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 human soldier at uncommon. You can pay 5 and tap it, and each opponent loses 2 life. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each creature card in your graveyard. In addition to having a cost reduction ability built in, this activated ability will feel cheaper in this format than it would normally, thanks to Power Stones. This seems like a nice win condition for the graveyard decks in the format, and that generally means black, white, and black, green. Black, green especially is interested in getting a bunch of creatures in the graveyard, but both of those color pairs are. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Carrion Locust, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/1 insect horror at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target card from an opponent's graveyard. If it was a creature card, that player loses 1 life. So this incidental graveyard hate is going to be pretty nice in this format, as there are plenty of things that will be nice to exile, including unearthed creatures. It comes attached to a reasonable flyer, and sometimes you'll even make your opponent lose a life. I'm giving this a C. Next, it's Corrupt, which for 5 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It deals damage to any target equal to the number of swamps you control. You gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. This is a neat reprint, and it gives you kind of a good reason to go hard into black, especially if you get multiples. This can be a very real win condition or an excellent removal spell. While it is costly and a sorcery, all the life it can gain you is enough to outweigh that. Now, you probably need to be doing 4 with this for it to feel decent, and 5 or more to really feel like you're getting there. And if you aren't a deck that's running like 12 or 13 swamps, it's going to be challenging to make that happen, so keep that in mind. It's probably a D in sort of a typical evenly divided two-color deck that has black in it, but a B minus or probably even higher if you can manage to draft something like a mono black deck. Next up, it's Diabolic Intent, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, and then shuffle. So, tutors just don't tend to perform well in Limited, and I don't think there's an exception here, even at 2 mana. This is mostly because you have to 2-for-1 yourself to make it do anything, and while some decks in Limited have powerful enough cards to make that worth doing, you usually won't have such a card. If you can find a way to sacrifice something worth less than a card, like a creature token, it does get more interesting, but I'm still not that impressed. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Disciples of Gix, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 Phyrexian human at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for up to 3 artifact cards, put them into your graveyard, and then shuffle. So the idea here is that you can search up stuff that you can get value out of while they're in the graveyard, and there are certainly artifacts with Unearth in this set. But the fact it doesn't let you search up creatures more broadly is a little frustrating, especially because the black-green deck in the format demands creatures specifically to be in the graveyard. Still, lots of artifacts in this set are creatures too, so it will be able to help out that kind of deck a decent chunk of the time. The stat line here is unfortunately really ugly. I wish they could have made it like a 4/5 or a 5/4 or something. This is really clunky, but it does seem like it can generate probably a full card worth of value with its Enter the Battlefield ability. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Disfigure, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. Target creature gets -2/2 until end of turn. As usual, this is premium removal. It can kill a wide spectrum of things for only 1 mana. Often you can trade up. I'm giving this a B-. Next, it's Dreams of Steel and Oil, which for 1 black is an uncommon sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an artifact or creature card from it, then choose an artifact or creature card from their graveyard, exile the chosen cards. This is a nice way to disrupt the opponent, and it can hit a whole lot of cards in the format. I'm usually not super high on discard, but when it gets down to a single mana and allows you to hit the majority of cards in the format, I'm on board. It's nice you even get to exile something, which will often at least take something away with Unearth or something like that from their graveyard. That isn't quite a 2-for-1, but if you hit a card in hand and a card they could use in their graveyard, you're getting kind of close. Don't get me wrong, it still isn't great. The fail case on the card where you don't hit anything is still pretty ugly, even if you can still exile something from the graveyard, and in those situations it's going to feel like you're mulliganing. It isn't completely useless when you draw it late and your opponent doesn't have any cards in their hand, but it's kind of close to being useless. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Emergency Weld, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Return target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. I like this. Gravedigger is always a nice card in Limited. This costs half as much for a creature, that's half the size, and still return something from your graveyard to your hand, and it even includes artifacts. Now, Gravedigger's a 2/2, so it's easier to get a 2-for-1 with than it will be with a 1/1, but this still seems pretty nice. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Fateful Handoff, which for 3 generic and a black is a rare sorcery. Draw cards equal to the mana value of target artifact or creature you control. An opponent gains control of that permanent. This feels like a card that's mostly here for Commander. In Limited, it seems pretty bad. Sure, you get to draw some cards, but giving your opponent a permanent is pretty darn bad, and you might be saying, well, give them something that isn't that good then. Well, if you're giving them a 1 or 2 mana card, it still really isn't worth it, since you spend a card to draw 2 cards and then give your opponent a permanent. And you still used a card to give your opponent that permanent, so you're starting way behind when you cast this. I guess if your deck has like a ton of removal, using this and drawing into that removal could be alright, but that's still too situational, and overall I think this is a card that should be avoided. I'm giving it an F. Next, it's Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If they do, they draw a card. And you can pay 4 generic and 3 black and discard X cards to exile the top X cards of target opponent's library. You may play lands and cast spells from among cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. This is great, mostly because of the first ability. Every single time you have a creature hit your opponent, you can pay 1 and draw a card, and that ability gets going right away. So the turn you play Gix, you can take advantage of that ability immediately, and that setup just means having played a couple of creatures before you played Gix, which is very doable. You probably win the game with the insane card advantage this gives you before you ever really get to the point that you can use the other ability, But obviously you're going to draw a bunch of cards, so you can also discard a bunch and pay 7 to cast cards from your opponent's library for free, which is also insane. This is a bomb. It isn't that hard to generate value with it before your opponent ever untaps, and if they don't kill it quickly, it will end the game in your favor. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Gix's Caress, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. Create a tapped Power Stone token. This is a discard spell I don't like very much. Coercion is basically never good and limited, and that's what the first part of this card is. Paying 3 to trade 1 for 1 and not do anything on the actual board is a problem, even if you do get to disrupt your opponent. This gives you a little thing back in the form of a Power Stone, which certainly makes it better, but I still don't like this. I'm giving it a D+. Next, it's Gix's Command, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. It says choose 2. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 creature. It gains lifelink until end of turn. Destroy each creature with power 2 or less. Return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Each opponent sacrifices a creature with the highest power among creatures they control. Like the other commands in this set, this looks great. You'll frequently want to make your opponent sacrifice their big creature, and that effect alone isn't worth that much more than 5 mana, or that much less than 5 mana, so everything else you can get here is pretty sweet, and most of it is very impactful. Making a creature bigger and giving it lifelink until end of turn can really change the game, as can sweeping away small creatures or returning 2 creatures to your hand from your graveyard. If you have the time to choose the removal option and return 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, that's really going to give you the most value the most consistently, because that's a 3 for 1. But the other options are nice too. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's Gixian Infiltrator, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 Phyrexian human at common. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Gixian Infiltrator. This is a solid, if unexciting, payoff that will work especially well in black-red decks. It starts with decent stats, and a few counters are enough to make it a threat. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Gixian Puppeteer, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/3 Phyrexian Warlock at rare. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And when it dies, return another target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this thing's really good. If it just had the first ability or the second ability, it would still be a very good card. So the fact you get both, which includes the ability to drain your opponent's life anytime you draw your second card, and the ability to reanimate something directly to the battlefield is pretty crazy. It also means it slots nicely into 2 different decks in the format. The black-white deck likes to get cheap creatures in the graveyard for the second ability, and the blue-black deck likes to draw extra cards, which will trigger the first ability, and you'll often have a mix of things that allow you to do both of these in most black decks. And it even has solid stats as a 4 mana 4/3. So if it stays in play, it can often win you the game with the life drain effect if you have enough ways to draw extra cards, and if your opponent deals with it, they usually get 2 for 1. Both of these abilities do take a little bit of work to make them do their full thing, but it's not going to be that hard. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's Gixian Skullflayer, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 Phyrexian human assassin at common. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Gixian Skullflayer. This is a nice payoff for getting creatures in your graveyard, a strategy that looks to be well supported in the format. I do wish this enabled itself a little bit more, just like by milling a single card or something, but it will be able to grow with relative ease in black-green decks especially. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Gnawing Vermin, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 rat at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, target player mills 2 cards. When it dies, target creature you don't control gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This gives you a couple of small effects, but getting both of them for 1 mana seems like a pretty solid deal. A 1 mana 1/1 that gives -1/-1 to something when it dies is usually pretty nice, as it can trade up for X2s and even get a 2 for 1 if your opponent has 2 X1s. The fact it mills sets up a couple of different black decks in the format too. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Go for the Throat, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant. It says destroy target non-artifact creature. As usual, this is premium removal. Yes, this set has a lot of artifact creatures, but that was true last time we saw it too. It still kills 80+% of the creatures in the set at a very efficient rate. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Gruesome Realization, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose one, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life, or creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. A black card that lets you pay 3 mana to draw 2 and pay 2 life is a card we see all the time in Limited, and it's usually fine, so having the option of using this to sweep away small creatures sometimes is a nice addition. I think this is a C+. Next, it's Gurgling Anointer, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/3 Phyrexian Horror at uncommon. It's got flying. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Gurgling Anointer, and when it dies, return another target creature card with mana value less than or equal to Gurgling Anointer's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is a very impressive uncommon. The blue-black deck in the format's all about drawing cards and getting extra value out of it, and this is going to be pretty much your premier payoff for doing so at a lower rarity because it's crazy powerful. Not only does it have flying and get larger and larger, it also lets you reanimate something when it dies. And sure, the Anointer needs to have high enough power to make that happen consistently, but because it's less than or equal to, just getting it to 2 power will often allow you to reap the benefits and get that 2-for-1. So yeah, if it stays in play, it wins games by attacking, and if your opponent deals with it, you get 2-for-1. Sounds a lot like that rare we just saw. But this one's uncommon. I wouldn't have been surprised if this were a rare, and I think this is better than a whole lot of rares in the format. I'm giving it a B+. Next, it's Hostile Negotiations, which for 3 generic and a black is a rare instant. It says exile the top 3 cards of your library in a face-down pile, then exile the top 3 cards of your library in another face-down pile. Look at the cards in each pile, then turn a pile of your choice face up. An opponent chooses one of those piles, put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard, you lose 3 life. This is a very cool and flavorful design, and I think actually a good card. You get to pay 4 mana to draw 3 cards at instant speed, and that's some serious business, even if you're paying 3 life. And yes, there's sort of a mini-game aspect to it where you try to get your opponent to give you the best pile, and that will be tricky sometimes, but the fact is, you cast this, you walk away with 3 cards, and you also get to load your graveyard, which definitely matters. I think this is a B. Next, it's Killzone Acrobat, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 human soldier at common. When it attacks, you may sacrifice another creature or artifact. If you do, it gains flying until end of turn. There are plenty of expendable things to give this flying when it needs to. Gain flying in order to do damage, whether you're giving up power stones or creatures with unearth or creature tokens or whatever. I'm giving this a C. Next, it's Misery's Shadow, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 shade at rare. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. You can pay 1 generic, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a very impressive 2 mana 2/2. It can buff itself quite easily and efficiently. Don't underestimate how much easier it is to pay a single colorless mana for the buff than it would be if it cost colored mana. Buff effects that cost colored mana often have limitations when you're in a 2-color draft deck, but with this, every single land in your deck can pump this +1/+1, and that's also true of all your power stones. So this creature stays relevant all game long thanks to that ability to buff itself, which it can do quite easily, and the exile clause definitely matters too. I think this is a B+. Next, it's Moment of Defiance, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 and gains a lifelink until end of turn, draw a card. So this is expensive for a trick that only boosts toughness by 1. Experience tells us that a toughness boost of 1 is not enough to save creatures from combat all that often. But it definitely makes up for that by drawing you a card. In situations where your creature does survive, you get a powerful 2-for-1, and in situations where it doesn't, you break even while gaining some life. It also draws you a card, checking the box for that blue-black deck. I'm giving this a C. Next, it's No One Left Behind, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets a creature card with mana value 3 or less. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is a really cool design for a reanimation spell. We see 5 mana reanimation spells all the time, and most of them are pretty mediocre, because the setup of having something worth reanimating in your graveyard is surprisingly challenging in most formats. This makes up for that in a big way, since you can reanimate 3 mana things for only 2 mana. In other words, setting this up so it's actually worth using is way easier than most versions of this effect we've seen before, and it still has the same super powerful top end of being able to reanimate a massive bomb or something for 5 mana. Black decks look well positioned to take advantage of this. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Overwhelming Remorse, which for 4 generic and a black is a common instant. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature card in your graveyard. Exile target creature or planeswalker. A card that was always 5 for this effect is probably a C+, and this will often cost significantly less. Getting it down to 4 is super doable. I think this is premium removal. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Painful Quandary, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. This is a reprint, and it's pretty bad and limited. The problem is that your opponent can find ways to set up situations where it's easy for them to choose an option that doesn't really hurt them that much. Either they have plenty of life and they don't care about losing life, or they can just hold on to cards to discard them. Giving your opponent that option of how to deal with this really lets them choose a path that won't affect them that much. There are going to be situations where it's crazy good, like when your opponent's at exactly 5 life. It's going to cause some problems, obviously. But there's going to be a lot of games where it has a completely minimal impact, especially because it's a 5-mana enchantment that does not immediately impact the board. It's just an F. Next, it's Power Stone Fracture, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery, is an additional cost to cast it, sacrifice an artifact or creature, destroy target creature or planeswalker. In case you didn't get it from the card's name, the best thing to do here is going to be to sacrifice a Power Stone. In that case, you aren't really using up a real card, and that's good, because giving up a real card to cast this is pretty bad. This falls below premium removal, and it has too much setup involved with it. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Ravenous Gigamole, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 mole horror at common. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards. You may put a creature card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on Ravenous Gigamole. This loads your graveyard and will frequently also get you something back, and when it doesn't, you have a 4-mana 3/4 that helps you load your graveyard. Seems solid enough. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Thran Vigil, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever 1 or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard during your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So the biggest thing that this works with is Unearth, but there are other ways to get it going in black. Anything that returns a creature card from your graveyard to your hand or to the battlefield will trigger it, and there's a decent amount of that in the set, but this is still obviously a build around, because not all decks, even black decks, will reach a critical mass of synergy that will actually make this worth running. It's probably just a D in your typical black deck in the format, and a B- in a deck that gets there on synergy. Next, it's Thraxodemon, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 demon at common. You can pay 3 and tap it and sacrifice another creature or artifact to draw a card. So, it's a bear with decent upside. Giving up a creature or artifact to draw a card is fine, though I don't love paying 3 mana for the effect. Power Stones will soften the blow some, because you can use the Power Stone to pay for it, and then sacrifice the Power Stone to it. In that case, it feels more like pay 2, tap, and sacrifice a Power Stone, which definitely seems like a better ability. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Trench Stalker, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/5 beast horror at common. As long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, it has Death Touch and Lifelink. Obviously, if this always had Death Touch and Lifelink, it would be a B or a B-. That's just a very real creature that can't be ignored. Unfortunately, it doesn't always have those keywords, though getting them online will be doable in the blue-black deck especially. I'm giving this a C. Now, let's move to the artifacts that have a black identity. First, there's Ashnod's Harvester, which for 2 generic mana is a 3/1 artifact creature construct at uncommon. When it attacks, you exile a card from a graveyard, and it has Unearth for 1 generic and a black. This means you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, it gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next instep, or if it would leave the battlefield, Unearth only as a sorcery. So a 2-mana 3/1 that hates on the graveyard will pretty much always make the cut, especially when it's an artifact. Unearth and other graveyard action is, as we've seen in this video, a very real presence in the format, and being able to take one of those away from your opponent will feel pretty nice. It can even Unearth itself to take another card out of the equation, and a 3/1's a pretty effective attacker on many boards that your opponent kind of has to respect that it's going to be unearthed at some point. I think this is a C+. Next, it's Clay Revenant, which for 1 generic mana is a 1/2 artifact creature golem at common. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to your hand. This kind of creature underperforms in almost all formats, and I think this version is worse than most cheap creatures who make you pay mana to get them back from the graveyard. The idea here is that this is something you can sacrifice over and over again, or that you can get value out of if you discard or mill it, but it's just so clunky. You have to pay a total of 4 mana to get it back into play, and that is dismal, even with Power Stones. What's more is most of the sacrifice stuff in this format you can just sack Power Stones to, and that's just going to be better and more efficient than ever using Clay Revenant. I'm giving it a D. Next, it's Dredging Claw, which for 2 generic is an equipment at common. It gets +1/+0 and menace to the creature it's equipped to. And when a creature enters the battlefield from the graveyard, you may attach Dredging Claw to it, and you can equip it for 1 generic and a black. +1/+0 and menace is okay. It's not a great boost for 2 mana to play and 2 mana to equip. But the cool thing here is that if you have unearthed creatures, it will equip to them for free, drastically increasing the chance that creatures can crack in for some damage when they come back from the graveyard. Still, this is mediocre enough with creatures that aren't coming back from the graveyard that I have a hard time really wanting to play this in a lot of decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Goring Warplow, which for 6 generic mana is a 5/4 artifact creature construct at common. It has Death Touch. It also has Prototype, which means you can pay an alternate cost, and it comes into play with a different color and size and keeps its abilities and types. In this case, you pay 1 generic and a black for a 1/1. So 2 mana for a 1/1 with Death Touch is all right. That card's probably a C-, and a 6 mana 5/4 with Death Touch is probably also a C-, maybe a D+, but having the option between the two makes this a solid C. Next, it's Phyrexian Fleshgorger, which for 7 generic mana is a 7/5 artifact creature Phyrexian Worm at Mythic Rare. It has Menace and Lifelink, and it has Ward, pay life equal to Phyrexian Fleshgorger's power, and it has Prototype for 1 generic and 2 black, in which case it's a 3/3. Both options here are pretty amazing. If you can cast it on turn 3, it's going to be a real problem for your opponent. It represents a problematic threat that will quickly make the gap between your life and your opponent's insurmountable, and the fact it has Ward means that even if your opponent can't kill it, they have to give up some life. Obviously, casting this for 7 in the late game is going to be even better a lot of the time, as it becomes, of course, a 7/5, which also means the ward is even more painful. Interacting with the 7/5 version of this card is a complete nightmare, since Menace and Lifelink will make it very hard to take it down profitably, and it isn't like your removal will feel great either, thanks to ward. I'm giving this an A. Next, it's Razorlash Transmogrant, which for 2 generic is a 3/1 artifact creature zombie at rare. It can't block. You can pay 4 generic and 2 black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. This ability costs 4 less to activate if an opponent controls 4 or more non-basic lands. So this card's definitely going to be good in constructed aggro decks. It isn't unplayable in Limited either, but not being able to block is a bigger downside in Limited, as trading is such a big part of the game, and you'll never be able to reduce the cost of the graveyard activated ability in Limited either, as there just aren't enough non-basics in the format. So all of that out of the way, this is still a creature that can attack pretty effectively on a lot of boards, and you can get it back from the graveyard as a 4/2 when you have the time to, and that's pretty nice, especially because Power Stones will help you get there. Like I said, not being able to block is a problem, but if you can consistently bring this back as a 4/2 in the mid to late game that you can just throw at your opponent every turn, it's not really something they can ignore. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Scrapwork Rager, which for 4 generic mana is a 2/2 artifact creature Phyrexian Horror. At common, when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life, and it has Unearth for 3 generic and a black. This is a fun reference to Phyrexian Rager. When you cast it, it's a little worse than the Rager was, since you pay 1 mana for the same effect, but the Unearth side of things makes this bad boy potentially give you a 3-for-1, because it will draw you 2 cards, and theoretically, the 2/2 when you cast it normally will trade for something, and that's pretty nice. Like Phyrexian Rager, I think this comes out to a B-. Next, it's Transmigrant Altar, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1 black, tap it, and sack a creature to gain 3 colorless mana. You can pay 2 and tap it and sacrifice a creature to create a 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token, activate only as a sorcery. There is a real sacrifice deck in this format, so this is pretty intriguing. There's plenty of fodder and payoffs, so generating extra value when you use these abilities isn't far-fetched, and that seems pretty good. In that sort of deck, this looks like it could be a very real engine. I do think it needs a build-around grade, as it probably doesn't make sense outside of a black-red deck. And even then, you have to end up with enough sacrifice synergies and sacrifice fodder, or it just won't work out. This is probably a D in your typical deck in the format, and a B- in the black-red deck. And our last card is Transmigrant's Crown, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +2/+0. When the creature dies, you draw a card, and you can equip it for 2 generic or 1 black. This sort of feels like a fixed Skull Clamp. It isn't quite as busted as that card was, of course, but this is still very powerful, especially if you can consistently only pay a single mana to equip it. +2/+0 is enough to make many creatures a threat, and your opponent will absolutely hate the idea of trading with anything this is equipped to. So you'll put them in a horrible spot where they have to take a bunch of damage or get 2 for 1. Sometimes they'll be able to chump, of course, but you're still coming out ahead there. Because the equip is so cheap, you can also move it in the second main phase very easily, making another creature into a better blocker that will also generate a 2 for 1. On top of that, even paying 2 to equip this is pretty good. You'll play it in every single deck in the format. It may not quite reach bomb status if you're having to pay 2 every time, but it's definitely a bomb if you're playing this in a black deck. I'm giving it an A-. So, those are all the black cards in the Brothers War. Tomorrow I'll be back with a look at all the red cards. If you want to make sure you catch that video, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it. If you want to catch up on the rest of this set review, you will see the playlist shortly. Thanks for watching.